Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, but more specifically, we're going to discuss the Ether Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. The Ether Bitcoin valuation is actually one of the most interesting trends in crypto to follow, in my opinion. And one of the reasons, of course, is because I think it sort of helps us better understand where the Bitcoin dominance is in its journey. Okay. Now, I want to sort of set the stage before we go through sort of the outlook going into the next few months, and just to provide a framework from, going over where I've come from over the last few years and how I've shifted my view at hopefully appropriate times, right? So the first thing I will say is that I am not macro bearish on the Ether Bitcoin pair, despite what you might hear. But what I am is short-term bearish on it until we go back to looser monetary policy. That is my view. You don't have to agree with that view, but a lot of people have disagreed with it ever since the merge. And ever since the merge, Ether Bitcoin has in fact put in lower highs and lower lows. I mean, it's an indisputable fact. This is the merge right here, September of 2022. And despite all the criticism that I've received for this view, people saying, well, the tokenomics and all this other stuff, it's a game changer, etc. We have seen lower highs and lower lows on the Ether Bitcoin pair ever since the merge, right? Ever since the merge, this is what we've seen. Now, some people have taken that view and they've run with it to sort of portray me as a macro bear on the Ether Bitcoin valuation. But that is fundamentally not true, okay? The first two videos on my channel, again, I've said this before, but I feel like I have to remind people, because otherwise they'll see something else something different somewhere else. The first two videos on my channel are in fact about Ethereum. And, this here is the second video I ever put, this is the second video you'll even find. It's the second oldest video on my channel. Ether Bitcoin is severely undervalued. This was when it was at 0.02 in late 2019. Look at late 2019. What do you notice about why it bottomed then? Why did it bottom then? Was it just because, oh, it's Q3 of the pre-halving year? Was it because of some other random reason? Or was it because the Fed had just started cutting interest rates in July, and Ether Bitcoin bottomed out 2 months later? Could that be the reason? We had just gone back to looser monetary policy, and therefore, fundamentally riskier assets stop bleeding against lower risk assets. Now, a lot of people would disagree with the view that Ether is riskier. A lot of people would disagree with that view. But there's a lot of counterpoints to that as well. You could look at modern portfolio theory and see that if you calculate out your risk-adjusted returns, let's go find this here, modern portfolio theory. If you calculate out your risk-adjusted returns for Bitcoin and ETH, to maximize your Sharpe ratio, it calls for 74% Bitcoin and 26% ETH. To maximize your Sortino ratio, which does not punish negative volatility, it calls for 76% Bitcoin and 24% ETH. So if you base it on just modern portfolio theory, which is a classical theory that people have been using for decades, it would suggest that your risk-adjusted returns are better off being heavier Bitcoin over the years. That doesn't mean you can't make money with Ethereum. It just means that it tends to bleed in, during bear market years and pre-halving years. And I know a lot of people say, well, but Ethereum always outperforms Bitcoin in the bull market. And I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that. But again, the counterpoint is that while it may be true that it did outperform Bitcoin, which we said it was likely going to, it's also true that it did not put in a new high, right? I mean, 2017, Ether Bitcoin went to 0.15. And then in January 2018, it went to like 0.12. Now, we could make a case that we should be looking at the market cap valuation instead of the price valuation, and we'll look at that a little bit later if I can remember to do so. But the point is that it hasn't put in new highs since 2017, right? I mean, you're talking about 6 years. Now, it's also been putting in higher lows, which is also a point that we should think about, right? Like, it's not, you can't just look at the highs and say lower highs. You also look at the lows and say, well, it's also putting in higher lows. So I think there's a common ground that the bears and the bulls can come to in this. And I've said that many, many times before. And my view is that it doesn't matter if you're long-term bullish on Ether Bitcoin, it could still go down in the short term and still fulfill your dreams in the next, over the next several years, right? So that's what I want to talk about. So again, the very first 2 videos on my channel are about Ethereum. I was talking about timing the long-term momentum shifts. I mean, barely anyone even watched these videos because I just started YouTube. But that is what I want to note, that is where I came from, being bullish on it in 2019. Okay. And I suggested back then that it would likely trend higher for several years before topping out. But once 2022 arrived, right? Once 2022 arrived, I had to turn bearish on the Ether Bitcoin valuation. And one of the reasons is because we shifted back to tighter monetary policy. And what you'll notice is that the Ether Bitcoin pair topped out here just before we started to get our first rate hikes, right? So we can go back and forth about the fundamentals all we want to, but the reality is that Ether Bitcoin bottomed just after the Fed started cutting rates, and it topped just before the Fed started raising rates. Okay? So again, we can go back and forth about the tokenomics all you guys want, and I'm happy to respond to that. I respond to many of you on Twitter about it. But again, the reality is that it bottomed out right after the first rate cut. It topped out just before the first rate hike. So in the same way as the very first videos on my channel, to be on the lookout for a potential macro bottom on the Ether Bitcoin pair, I would want to first see a rate cut, right? That is what I would want to see. We haven't gotten that yet. So because of that, I still remain short-term bearish on the Ether Bitcoin pair, which again has been a very controversial view. But despite it being a controversial view, I don't think anyone can say it was the wrong view. Since the merge, Ether Bitcoin has been putting in lower highs. Now, again, you might say, well, it's easy in hindsight, right? It's easy in hindsight. But guys, we talked about this every step of the way, right? Literally on the day of the merge, we put out a video called Ethereum, the merge. And we noted that this was likely a secondary distribution phase when this was at 0.08, right? And we even said it going into it, it's likely a secondary distribution phase. You might wonder, what do I mean by a secondary distribution phase? Where is this coming from? Well, basically the idea is that, Bitcoin had sort of 2 distribution phases in 2021, right? Right here, 1, 2, 3, 4 peaks, a cool off period, and then a secondary distribution phase that consisted of 2 well-defined peaks. So you had 4 peaks and then 2 peaks. And then Bitcoin bled back down to the range lows, right? That's basically what happened. So when the merge happened, we were looking at this and I'm like, well, gosh, it looks awfully familiar. It looks like what we saw Bitcoin do, where it essentially, has this distribution phase, these 4 peaks, and then you go into the secondary distribution phase where you get this double peak right around the time of the merge. So then, ever since then, we have in fact seen lower highs and lower lows, despite all the deflationary aspect, right? Despite all of that, we have in fact seen lower highs and lower lows ever since. So where are we today, and what are the expectations? Well, I will briefly say, just sort of give you guys a brief synopsis of what I've previously said. I think it's at least worthwhile to know where I'm coming from, what have been my views over the last 6 months, so that you can better, assess my views, my current views, right? It's sort of like, like if you put out a theory and it's wrong, then a lot of people aren't going to really care about what you have to say about it in over the next few months, right? You were on the wrong side of it. It's like, my assumption was that the yearly high for Bitcoin was in, at around 35K, right? I said many times that I thought, and this was back when the year started, when Bitcoin was at 16K, 20K, whatever. I said I thought that Bitcoin could go as high as 35K this year. Now that it's gone above 35K, I'm not going to sit here and try to, move the goalpost and figure out exactly where it's going to top out. But that was my view. And we broke 35K. And so, I'm just going to kind of see what happens with Bitcoin, right? I don't know. I don't know exactly how high it's going to go. But what I will say is that the fundamental process that's going on remains unchanged. And what we've seen is that Bitcoin rallies, it breaks all Bitcoin pairs off support levels. And then when Bitcoin drops later on, those all Bitcoin pairs don't recover. They just stay at the new low, right? We've seen that literally, all year long. And the Bitcoin dominance view was another controversial view, but now it seems like a lot more people are on board with it. Which maybe, I still think there are some people that are fading it, but, once everyone's fading it, it might be time to switch that view. But one thing that I want to mention is that, so this was sort of our, the view that I put out. This was 5 months ago, right? So 5 months ago, this is when it sort of rallied back up. And I said, all right, it's likely going to get rejected. You can see that it did, right? It got rejected right there. Pretty clear rejection back down. And then, 4 months ago, similar idea, right? When it was at 0.067, likely going to fade back to the downside, come back down to the range lows, get a nice bounce, and then drop. And then same thing, right? 4 months ago, down, bounce, drop. Ongoing collapse video, right? Go back down to the range lows, bounce, drop. So that has been my view. And I have been unwavering in that view ever since the merge, right? Unwavering in it. I think that the Ether Bitcoin pair is in the process of a downtrend. Now, what are some views to sort of contest this view? Because it is important to note that just because I've been right about the drop of Ethereum back down to the range lows, even though I've been right about that, it doesn't mean I'm going to be right about what happens next, right? My views, what happens in the market can sort of follow someone's views for a while, but I could still retain those views, and then the market could deviate from that, right? So if the path for the Ether Bitcoin pair was to put in a low and then to come back down and retest that low and then go up, it would appear that I would be right about my views about sort of a macro drop, even though it could just sort of simply bounce from where it did last time, right? So we must understand that just because I've been correct about the path so far does not mean that I will continue to be correct about it. I could start to be wrong about it. And that is something that I would have to sort of face if that happened, right? But in the meantime, this is playing out more or less how we suggested it would. Admittedly, it has taken longer than I thought it would. I mean, when Ether Bitcoin topped out over here at 0.085 back in September 2022 in the merge video, it's not like I thought it was going to take 15 months for it to get back down, or 14 to 15 months for it to get back down to the range lows, right? Like it's not like I would have told you back then, hey guys, it's going to go down, but it's going to take 14 months. I probably would have said, all right, we'll probably be back down there within like 6 months or something. I had no idea it was going to take 14 months to get back down here. But here we are, right? We found ourselves back down at the range lows regardless. And then I put out a video yesterday on Bitcoin dominance where I said that, there's a good chance that whether Ether Bitcoin breaks down or not, there's a good chance that in the short term, it will get a short-term bounce back up. And that will be sort of the pivotal moment that defines what Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation will do probably for the next 6 to 12 months. What happens over the coming weeks, okay? So to sort of briefly recap, last cycle, Ether Bitcoin did not bottom until we started getting rate cuts. This cycle, it topped just before the first rate hike. Now, you might say, why did it top out before the first rate hike? Well, the market is forward-looking, right? It's forward-looking. So then you might say, well, if it's forward-looking, why didn't it bottom out before rate cuts? Well, the thing about rate cuts is that oftentimes, you know, the first rate cut is not even necessarily sufficient to really help those risk assets. That's why a lot of times when the Fed's cutting rates, the stock market will continue to sell off until they get to the point that it's accommodative enough for the economy to start expanding again, right? So like in the current cycle, right, the Fed funds rate's at 5.5%. If we get a cut sometime in 2024, let's say they shave off 50 basis points, if that's not enough, the stock market will tell them that, and it'll just keep dropping, and it'll keep dropping until the Fed cuts enough. But over here, the market was probably satisfied with this cut. I mean, you know, the Fed funds rate was at 2.25%. It's not like it was that high. So I would like to see a rate cut before I would get too optimistic about a macro bottom on the Ether Bitcoin pair. It doesn't mean you're not going to get sometimes like these short-term bottoms. Even this low over here, while it was significant, it still just led to a lower high at the end of the day, right? I mean, this is still a lower high. It did not take out the prior high of 0.088. Still a lower high. Even the merge rally did not put Ether Bitcoin at a new high, right? Isn't that, I mean, think about it. Even that merge rally, all the hype back then in Q3 2022, all of that, it still could not take out the high from late 2021, okay? So we've seen this move play out so far, right? And essentially what that move is, you know, it breaks to the downside. I said in a lot of the prior videos that once it gets below 0.058 is where it likely accelerates to the downside. Okay, I said it many, many times. 0.058 is the magic number. It was the magic number last cycle, right? Where sort of it started to accelerate right here. It started to drop. Now, again, I don't know that this is necessarily the best comparison because this is 2018 and we're currently in 2023, but that was what I was looking at, right? I was thinking, all right, well, 0.058 is where it could accelerate. That's not the only reason. The other reason is if you look at this trend line here, once we were getting close, that was also corresponding to around 0.058. So what I said is that if the Ether Bitcoin pair breaks below 0.058, then the losses of it could start to accelerate to the downside back to the prior range lows, right? Back to these lows over here. But as we drew out, right, in many of these videos, we sort of drew out it coming back down to the range lows and then getting a bounce, right? I mean, basically every video we did, we talked about it, right? Down and then get a bounce before dropping. That, I think, is what's currently happening right now, right? We're in that bounce off of the range low. And now we have to figure out if it's basically, is it the same thing that happened over here where it just rallies back up and then we, you know, the bears and the bulls of the Ether Bitcoin pair have to spend the next 12 months arguing about which way it's going to go? Or is this rally going to get rejected, unlike this one? I think it's more likely that this rally gets rejected. Not only for the fact that we are still in tighter monetary policy than we were previously, but also if you look at the nature of this drop, it was very, very quick. Very quick, right? There was not a whole lot of effort to sustain higher Ether Bitcoin pairs, and so it went straight back up, right? There not a whole lot of necessarily like resistance levels. It was just a pretty quick drop, and then we quickly reclaimed that range. The most recent drop is very different, right? We spent months on all of these support levels, months, where Ether Bitcoin would try to hold all of these levels, and it never could. Why did it keep breaking down? All of these breakdowns by the Ether Bitcoin pair occurred, a lot of them occurred on Bitcoin rallies. Remember, it is a Bitcoin rally in the pre-halving year that breaks Bitcoin pairs off of their support levels. So that after Bitcoin drops back to the downside, right? Like you can see here, Bitcoin rallied, it broke Ether off this support level. Then Bitcoin dropped back down, but Ether Bitcoin never reclaimed that prior support level. So the point is to say Bitcoin rallies in pre-halving years and bear market years often will break alt Bitcoin pairs down so that when Bitcoin drops back down, those altcoins have nowhere to hide. Now, I don't really consider ETH an alt. I think it's more of like an index to sort of track the altcoin market. Like sort of like if you have an altcoin and if it can't keep up with the gains of ETH or it's relatively underperforming ETH, and like why do you hold it? It's the same thing with Ethereum and Bitcoin. You know, that's why I've been a big proponent of Bitcoin dominance this year. And my crypto portfolio for the last couple of years has been predominantly just Bitcoin because I suspect that it will outperform most of the rest of the market, not all of the market, but most of the rest of the market. And that's why the dominance has gone higher. So when you look at this chart, it's Bitcoin rallies that break Ether Bitcoin down. And look at this breakdown. It finally broke this wedge to the downside. Now, a lot of people, I know because I spent a long time chatting with them on Twitter is a nice way to say it, is a lot of people said this was going to break to the upside, right? But I said, no, it probably won't. It'll do what it did last cycle and break to the downside. It's the same thing it did last cycle. And it has, right? It broke to the downside. And now we find ourselves in a position here, if I sort of just connect the dots, where the Ether Bitcoin pair is sort of, potentially back testing this trend line. The trend line that it held as support in October of 22, in March of 23, and in June of 23, and in September of 23. It's now testing it from beneath in November of 23. Now, I contend that this could offer a significant resistance level, right? And there's still some wiggle room here. I mean, like it could still move up slightly and still, be convincingly below this trend line. There's also the bull market support band, which is just above this trend line. So if it does break through, you still have to contend with that, which it keeps getting rejected by. Even if it sometimes gets above it, it's pretty short-lived. And ever since the merge, right, and there's a month or two over here where it was above it, but it just keeps getting rejected by it, right? So then I think that there's a lot of resistance here. And while there was there weren't really a whole lot of resistance levels for it to get back through over here. Here there are. I mean, there's all these resistance levels. And I mean, you could draw them horizontally if you prefer, right? And just sort of look at some of these resistance levels that Ether Bitcoin tried to hold. It's got a lot to get through in order to prove something. And there were a lot of people that tried all year long that hoped that Ether Bitcoin would stay at higher valuations, and it did not stop it from bleeding. So my guess is that it gets rejected, right? Now, look, there's a counterpoint, and I know everyone on Twitter is I'm sure drawing this trend line, right? Right here, right? So let me just delete everything and try to clean this up a little bit so we can look at a little bit clearer. Let me see if it works on so this is a regular scale. So if you draw the trend line on a regular scale, I mean, if it depends on which dots you connect, right? If you ignore these wicks and you connect these dots, we already sort of briefly went below it. If you connect that line here, you can see that we would still have plenty of room to fall even before getting there. But if you look at it on a log scale, which is what a lot of people look at it on, it's probably what you should look at it on. You can see that, I mean, it depends on how you draw it, I guess. But I mean, how are people drawing it, right? Like this, where they're getting a little cute with the trend. Okay, there you go. So low. I mean, I'm not even touching it. That low's not even touching right there. If I'm honest about it, it puts it right there, and you can see that it sort of broke a little bit down right there. But if we sort of stretch it, right? If we just give it a little wiggle room, you can look at it like that. So there's a lot of people looking at this trend line and saying that it will hold. Okay. I doubt it, right? I doubt it. But with that said, it's taken a long time for Ether Bitcoin to get to this point, and it's always possible that it takes months. Even if this trend line breaks, it could still take months before that happen, or it could take another day, right? It could take one day for it to happen if the market moves very quickly. So that's a counterpoint that you will often see people use, is to say, well, there is this trend line. oftentimes, one of the problems I have with these views about these people that draw these trend lines is that like 99% of them were never calling for a drop in the first place, right? They were never saying that it was going to go back down to this level in the first place. And they were very bearish on the Bitcoin dominance. And now that it's here, right, they say, all right, it's a buy the dip opportunity. But it's like, well, it's not like you thought it was going there in the first place. So yes, of course, it's going to always be a buy the dip opportunity if you have that view. Just like they would have probably said that it was a buy the dip opportunity at 0.066 and 0.062 and 0.06 and 0.05. Yeah, I mean, like, yes, I get that view. And there's a lot of people that just, no matter what happens, they only ever say buy the dip on this. And it's like, yeah, like, okay, but the dip keeps dipping. And maybe this is where it turns around. But, when people call me out on it and I go back and look at sort of their thoughts previously, there was no mention of this significant of a drop. One of the other reasons that we talked about this, if you look at monthly returns for Ether Bitcoin in the pre-halving year, in the second half of the pre-halving year, you can see that it was pretty red in 2019, right? You had a lot of pretty red months, just like we've had in 2023. If you look at quarterly returns for Ether Bitcoin, let's go look at quarterly returns. So we're going to pull up the Ether Bitcoin pair. It's literally been red every single quarter. Q1, negative 11.5%. Q2, negative 0.8%. Q3, negative 2.35%. And Q4, negative 7.5% or so. So it's been red all year long. If you look at the Ether Bitcoin monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, which are kind of an interesting way to look at the market, every candle in 2023 has been red when you look at the Heikin-Ashi candles, which I think are oftentimes a better representation, right? It sort of tunes out some of the noise. Every single candle has been red all year long, right? All year long. So, I can't help but think that it likely will eventually break down. That doesn't mean it has to happen tomorrow. And if it doesn't break down by, say, mid-December, then it could get a more sustained bounce for a couple more months, because there has been a lot of seasonality with the Ether Bitcoin pair in January, right? So like, this move here came in January. This move here came in January, right? And I've talked about this on my channel many times, right? This move started in December and then it topped out in January. This move started in December, right? I moved back to the upside. This one started in December. This one started in, like that December, January timeframe. But last year was different. What happened? It did not get any such bounce, right? I mean, December was red, and so was January. And basically almost every single month has been red, except for a few green months sprinkled in that did not accomplish anything but make people think that it was going to hold up. So, I mean, again, I'm still of the opinion that it's more likely to get rejected than anything else. And if it does bounce, I still suspect that there could come a period where Ether Bitcoin goes down lower than this level here. And I will retain that view until we go back to looser monetary policy. All I can look at is the fact that typically higher risk bleeds to lower risk during tighter monetary policy. Typically, for most things, not everything. There's always a few things that outperform, but for most things, that's what happens. And that's what's been happening so far this tightening cycle. Now, we could also compare this in other ways. One of the reasons why I suggested that we could see Ether Bitcoin bounce off the prior range low is because that's exactly what it did last cycle, right? I mean, look at what happened it did last cycle. It put in a low. It then revisited that low, bounced, but then it rolled over. It actually bounced the second time, right? It actually bounced three times, and it was a fourth attempt that finally broke it to the downside. And you can even see over here, right? You can see over here that this wick was lower than this one, right? So you can kind of see that it tried to hold it like that. I mean, let me just sort of draw this level. It held it again, and then below. right? So you almost have to wonder, is it doing the same thing here, where this is your first attempt, this is your second, which is what we just hit. Note that the first bounce got a significant bounce back up near the high. But what do you notice? This high was still higher than this one. So you have this high here, you come back to this low, you bounce, you put in a lower high. And then you come back down again, and then you bounce again. So what if we're just in this phase where we're in this bounce right here? This bounce over here, by the way, this was a 400% move. The second bounce was only about a 70% move or so, right? So it wasn't nearly the same, the same level of a bounce. Let's just say it's an 80% move. This is a 400% move. So like, about 1/5. Right? This move here was an 80% move, which is funny because this 80% move is more similar to this secondary move. It shows you there's diminishing volatility from one cycle to another. This move over here so far has been about 15, 16%, which coincidentally is about 1/5 of this prior move. If it wanted to go up to about 1/4, it could still go a little bit higher, right? It could stop at 0.058. It could also stop at 0.06 or slightly above 0.06. Remember, the bull market support band for the Ether Bitcoin pair currently ranges from 0.06026 to 0.06063, right? So basically 0.0602 to 0.0606 is where the bull market support band currently is. So, I think there's a scenario where, it's getting this bounce, but what happens if it just gets sort of tangled up in the bull market support band and then eventually rolls back over again, and then it retests this trend line? And then if it bounces again, you can see that it got rejected by the bull market support band again. And then on the fourth attempt, it broke to the downside. So what if the final break to the downside, which who knows when it's going to come, right? It might not come until next year. I don't know. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen 3 months from now. It could happen 6 months from now. But whenever that move comes, that could correspond to rate cuts, interest rate cuts. If you go look at the bond market doesn't even think we get rate cuts until June. I don't know if the Fed will last that long, and you could see it break down sooner. There's a case to be made that the Fed won't pivot as quickly as they did last cycle because of inflation, and so it could break down sooner than when you get to those first rate cuts. Because again, this breakdown here started in July. Again, what was going on in July? That was the first rate cut. The breakdown occurred in July, which is the same time we got our first rate cut. Remember, markets sell off when the Fed's cutting rates. Normally, because the Fed's only cutting rates because something bad is happening in the economy. And if something bad's happening, the risk assets are selling off. So I still retain the same view. And, I will continue to defend this view. And I would say that it's been the accurate view. I can't see any reason why people would say that it's been wrong. It's been right. The other view has not been correct, right? Like the view that the merge was going to change everything has not been correct, because ever since then we've seen lower highs and lower lows. So, if you could also go look at, like the year-to-date ROI stuff I know it's dubious at best, especially given what Bitcoin is doing right now. But just if you wanted to see it, right? Just if you're curious. If you look at Ether Bitcoin and you look at it in 2023, you compare it to 2019, it's not that dissimilar, right? It bled. In 2019, it got a more significant sell-off, but it still continued to bleed. It's gotten a little bit of a pop here, but what if it just, what if it hangs out around these levels and then just keeps bleeding, as the months go on? So that's where I stand on the Ether Bitcoin pair. Now, The bigger question is why does it go down? Does it go down because Bitcoin's going up and Ethereum is just going up less? Does it go down because Bitcoin's going down and Ethereum's going down more? Or does it go down because Bitcoin is flat and Ether is going down? All three scenarios you could find a plausible explanation for. I mean, with all the bullish momentum that Bitcoin has had, you know, the bullish case is that you just simply get another Bitcoin rally. And if a Bitcoin rally occurs, then it could potentially be sufficient to just break Ether Bitcoin down, right? There's a case to be made for that. Now, there's one thing I have to mention, I feel compelled to mention, even though I know it's not a popular view, and I don't necessarily believe it myself, but I don't necessarily believe everything I say. But I will say, while I think it's more so useful to compare this phase going on here with this one over here, one could make the case that it's similar to this move right here. One could make that case. I'm not saying you should, but one could. And the reason is because after we had this sell-off, you can see that the Ether Bitcoin pair bottomed at 0.054, which is exactly where it bottomed here in June of 2022. And then you can see that it topped out at 0.085, which is exactly where it topped out, right? So it bottomed here, and then topped here. And then it's back down to this region. Now, if you look closely, and you might have to squint your eyes, what you'll see is that Ether Bitcoin over here broke down to 0.054, right? It broke down to 0.054 and then rallied back up to where it is right now, around 0.058. And then it broke down. In this case, it broke down on a Bitcoin dump, right? It broke down on a Bitcoin dump. So again, I'm not saying it's necessarily the most likely outcome, but it is a outcome. It is a outcome. And you can see right here that this rally has taken Ether Bitcoin back up to where it was right there. Right? So that's something that I think is relevant to think about, even if it's not necessarily the most likely outcome. It is something that I feel I have to point out. So again, you could compare it to here. You could compare it to over here. In both cases, there was a bit of a move. The move that occurred in you know, if you look at it down here, it was a little bit longer lasting. The move over here was a lot shorter. You know, if we wake up one day and Bitcoin's down 20% and Ether is down 30%, then I think you could equate it more to this move. If, on the other hand, we spend the next couple of months and Ether Bitcoin just keeps chopping around this level without showing any signs of breaking down, then you perhaps could more so compare it to this move over here. There's all sorts of ways that we could look at this to try to figure out, you know, what resembles it the closest, right? I mean, if you look at their USD pairs, right? Like if you look at, I mean, if you look at Bitcoin, it's had a crazy move in a really short period of time. And, you know, the one thing that I've learned through the years, you know, I've often put out price predictions, and normally price predictions are too conservative or they're way too optimistic, right? So coming into this year, I said it'll likely not go above 35K. Now it went to 38K, right? And then of course everyone gives you a hard time about that. The hard part is if you put out a number that's higher than it goes and people give you a hard time about that, the only way that you're in the favor of the public is if you put out a price prediction and that's where it goes. And even then you're still not in the favor of the public for most of the year unless it happens, you know, and then it's only obvious in hindsight, you know, because there'll still be people that argue that the price will go somewhere different. So, you know, there's no way. I mean, putting out price predictions is not really a winning strategy. The winning strategy, I think, is to just try to figure out what are the general trends in the market, right? The general trends in the market have been Bitcoin dominance up, no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, Ether Bitcoin down, alt Bitcoin pairs down. That's been sort of the better view, I think, to have, rather than putting out specific price predictions. So, you know, if Bitcoin were to go up, right, if it were to continue to rally, then I would suspect Ether Bitcoin would break down. Why would I suspect that? Because that's what it's done all year. again, every single Bitcoin rally has just broken Ether down on its Bitcoin supports. It keeps breaking it down. Look at this rally right here, right? It broke it off that support. This rally over here broke it off this support. This rally right here broke it off that support, right? All of these rallies by Bitcoin just break Ether down. So if we were to get a significant rally by Bitcoin, Ether Bitcoin probably goes down because it just simply cannot compete with Bitcoin right now in tighter monetary policy. It can compete in looser monetary policy, right? If Bitcoin drops, then it would the case would be like, well, does Ether drop more, right? Does Ether drop more? And I think it would. Even it might not initially, but I think it probably would. There's sort of some glimpses of that if you look at lower time frames, right? There was let's again, I know this is a little weird, but look at this 5-minute time frame. We don't speculate too much on the 5-minute time frame. I just want to show you something. Do you see this correction that Bitcoin had right here? It was about a 5% drop, right? Not too bad. Not too bad. I don't even know what it did. I don't even know what it was for Ethereum. Maybe Ethereum held up better because of the whole ETF stuff, right? But let's just go look at Ether and see what the drop was from this level here all the way down. It was a 4% move. So Ether in the short term held up, right? It held up, which is great. It shows that it's at least bouncing off the lower part of the range, which we suggested that it would. So it's actually holding up better in that move than I thought it was, to just be completely honest. But what's more interesting is if you go look at the altcoin market during that drop by Bitcoin. Remember, Bitcoin dropped 5%. The altcoin market dropped almost 6%, right? So the altcoin market dropped more. A lot of times when we see Bitcoin drop quickly, we haven't seen the altcoin market drop just as much, right? A lot of times Bitcoin drops and then the dominance goes down because everything else is sort of, it's dropping, but it hasn't dropped as much as Bitcoin. But in this case, you can see pretty clearly that the altcoin market dropped about 5.7%, while Bitcoin dropped 5.5%. So again, it's not a huge difference, but there is a noticeable thing here that the altcoin market, when Bitcoin drops, it drops like that because there's very little liquidity compared to what we had in 2021. And some altcoins had, huge drops, right? Like Matic during that little drop, it dropped 10%, right? ADA, look at this. Look at this drop. 10, 11%. What did Polkadot drop? 13%. So when Bitcoin sneezes, the altcoin market gets very, very jittery, right? When just Bitcoin sneezes. Bitcoin went right back up to where it was, but the altcoin market just sold off like that. And that's what eventually happened in 2019. What happened in 2019 is a lot of people, YOLO'd into Bitcoin, they YOLO'd into altcoins after Bitcoin put in its yearly high, but the altcoin market topped out when Bitcoin did. It did not continue on. Why was that? Well, normally the alt market does well after Bitcoin hits new highs. This was not a new high. And if you overlay total 3 onto here, what you'll see is that total 3 actually topped out before Bitcoin did, the week before Bitcoin did. Right? You can pretty clearly see here that total 3 topped out before Bitcoin did. Well, this is doesn't include the wicks, but you can see it's around the same time, right? Like if you had taken your Bitcoin and converted it to altcoins at the top up here, it would not have worked out. Altcoins just bled with Bitcoin. It's not like 2021 where Bitcoin sort of topped out and then the altcoin market went on a fairly explosive run to the, move to the upside where it like doubled up in the matter of like just a week or two or a month or two. So there's a big difference between breaking new highs and what happens with altcoins after Bitcoin breaks new highs and what happens with altcoins when Bitcoin is just simply putting in a lower high like it did in 2019. There's a big difference. So that's I would at least caution people with that and to say be careful with that. Now, if you look at Ethereum, there's a lot of ways that we can look at this. Now, there's 2 ways that people are drawing this out. One way is to look at it like this, right? And say that it's an ascending triangle, right? That's one way to look at it. And I'm not here to say that that can't be the more appropriate way, right? I'm not. But you could also draw it out. Sorry, this is on a log scale. You could also draw it out like this, sort of an ascending wedge. You could also draw it out like that, which is an interesting way to draw it out. I mean, I think it's still valid. And if you look at it like this, that level becomes somewhat relevant. So if Bitcoin rallies, if Bitcoin were to rally, or if Ethereum just rallies, that level right here could be relevant. You know, 2200, 2300. I'm not saying it can't break above. If Bitcoin goes up enough, Ethereum could break above. But I'm just sort of pointing out that that is that level right around that 2200 to 2300. There's something interesting about this level because in 2019, when Ethereum topped out, where did it top out in 2019? It topped out when Bitcoin topped out, but it topped out right here. This high, which corresponded to this low that it hit in Q1 of the bear market year. That's where Ether topped out, right? So it went up to where this low was. Where do you think that translates to this cycle? That corresponds to this low, right? So if you draw that low across, that puts you right around where the price currently is. It's a little bit higher. I mean, again, these lines are pretty thick lines. If I prove it to you, if you look up here, right, these numbers right here, see the low. If I hover over that, 2160 is the low. 2160 on that low. And then here, the highest it went to was 2141 on this candle. And then currently today, the highest it's gone is 2131. So 2160 is where that low was. And remember, in 2019, this low here was 359.01, and Ethereum topped out at 363.29. So just like $4 higher. So then you have to wonder if this is a relevant way to draw it. Because if it is, that would basically correspond to the same level that Ether topped out back in 2019. Which, if that's the case, then there's a 6% move there that could happen. But that would sort of be the short-term bullish view. Now, if Bitcoin goes up enough, I mean, Ethereum can break through this, of course. But that is at least something that I noticed. And then the other thing that was interesting is Ethereum like rallied last cycle just before we had our the pandemic, the recession, and I believe it topped out just above the 100-week SMA, right? So you can see right here, it came close to getting to the 100-week in mid 2019. It did not hit it, just like it didn't hit it here. And then we got this pre-recession rally where it got just above the 100-week and then it collapsed. And Ether just got above the 100-week, right here. It's a good thing we're not worried about a recession, right? I'm just kidding, right? I mean, the unemployment rate is starting to go higher, which is an issue. Sorry, I didn't actually unemployment rate, right? Unemployment rate starting to go up. All right, that's where Ether topped out right before the recession, is when the unemployment rate started to go higher, and the unemployment rate is going up. And again, I mean, who knows how high it will go, but we just got continued claims today, and they're moving up. And we said, look, they're probably going to bottom out in September, just like they did last year, and they did. And it keeps going higher. And the issue with that is it tends to lead the unemployment rate, right? If you go look at unemployment rate versus claims, and we just look at continued claims and the unemployment rate, right? When continued claims start to go up, it tends to lead the unemployment rate, and continued claims are starting to go up. So the issue is that it might lead the unemployment rate. Initial claims are still low, which means that there hasn't really been a huge increase in the pace of layoffs. But because continued claims are going up, it tells you that the people that are getting laid off are having a harder time finding a job, right? Which could lead, it could be expressed in the unemployment rate as the months continue to pass us by. So that's sort of what I'm looking at with Ethereum and the Ether Bitcoin pair. My thoughts are that it will likely top out, relatively soon on this sort of this short-term bounce that the Ether Bitcoin pair has had, and that it likely will not bottom out until we go back to looser monetary policy. That is my view. That until we go back to looser monetary policy, it likely will not bottom out. And so until then, I just, I sort of maintain a bearish bias on the Ether Bitcoin pair. But once we go back to looser monetary policy, I will shift my view and I will be fully vocal about it. One last thing before I go, I said this earlier, is there's two ways to look at this, right? You can look at lower highs, but you could also look at higher lows and say, well, which one is more relevant, right? Which one is more relevant? I don't know. I really don't. What I've said before is that I'm bearish on the Ether Bitcoin pair until around 0.03 to 0.04. And then at that level, I would probably switch to neutral and just sort of wait and not necessarily wait. I mean, I probably would actually get some Ether with some of my Bitcoin, because I converted most of my Ether to Bitcoin last year. But that I think is something to think about, because I don't know what's more relevant here. Because you could draw this out several different ways, right? You could sort of think of it like a logarithmic regression type thing, where we sort of move off the regression and back down. So right, I mean that's kind of what I'm thinking. And so what I've said many times is that even if you're long-term bullish on Ether Bitcoin, it doesn't mean that it can't come back down here first. And again, it's not a dig at Ether. It's just to say that this is, it tends to drop during QT, during quantitative tightening. It tends to drop as interest rates are higher. And that's what it's done. It's dropped ever since interest rates have gone up. And so what I would look for is, if it comes back down here, that's when we start to say, all right, maybe then we focus on the higher lows. For now, I've still been focused on the lower highs just because we're still in QT. But as we get closer to QE, then you got to look at the higher lows and say, well, I mean, what if it just puts in a higher low and then goes back up? What if instead of ever putting in new highs, it's just converging to whatever the fair value is, right? What if the fair value is somewhere in here long term, and we just sort of oscillate in this range for years? There's a chance that happens. Anyways, I think we'll wrap it up. Actually, last thing, sorry. I'm not really sorry. If you look at Ether Bitcoin market cap, that's the other thing I wanted to mention, is that it tends to, we've seen it come up to the range high and then back down to the low and then back up to the high. And when we were back over here at the merge, I said that it'll likely bleed back down, and it has, right? So sort of extending these across, I still think I'm not, it doesn't have to come all the way back down here. It could, right? It could. We need to be open-minded about that. But I think that, if it were to drop, another, right? If it were to drop just down here, I think you could start to make the case that it's becoming a little bit more appealing. But it's hard. I mean, it's hard with it way up here for me to be that interested in it, especially during quantitative tightening. Anyways, we're wrapping up there, guys. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, remember, we do have the sale of Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link for that is in the description below. We have the website, which you saw part of, and a lot of other things. So make sure you guys check that out. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.